The world of motorsport has come to terms with the reality of just how dangerous it can get for the drivers. Although safety innovations have continually made racing safer, drivers and riders alike are fully aware of the risks involved. Sadly, this risk often isn't solely limited to the drivers, with many examples of spectators and event staff being caught in the crossfire. Possibly the worst example of a crash involving spectators was the Le Mans disaster of 1955. Despite the crash involving just 2 cars, over 83 people lost their lives as a result of a freak accident paired with little in the way of spectator safety. The 24-hour Le Mans event started as it would any other year, with intensely competitive driving which the fans were in awe of right from the start. Sadly, just 35 laps in, the race would take a turn for the worst. Mike Hawthorne, who was at the front of the pack in his Jaguar, was fighting toe-to-toe with Lance Macklin in an Austin Healey. Hawthorne then quickly got on the brakes to make a pit stop. At this point, Macklin was mere feet away from Hawthorne, and in an attempt to avoid crashing into Hawthorne's Jag and keep at the front of the pack, he quickly darted to the side and braked. What he didn't realise at the time was that this quick change of direction put him directly in the path of Pierre Levay, who was piloting a Mercedes 300 SLR. Much of the Mercedes had been made from a magnesium alloy, which is important later on. Pierre was now bombing towards Macklin's Healey at about 120 miles an hour, and a high-speed crash at this point was unavoidable. The Healey's rear end design is very low and sloping, a typical feature of many sports cars of the era. The front end of the Mercedes was equally rounded, which meant that when the two collided, Pierre's Mercedes was launched into the air with immense force, with the Austin acting as a sort of ramp. This is a shockingly similar scenario to the RS6 Autobahn incident of a couple of years ago. From looking at the track's layout, it's clear to see that Pierre in his Mercedes was headed straight for a large grandstand which lay meters from the track, with spectators shielded by next to nothing. The Mercedes landed with considerable force short of the spectators, however it bounced before smashing into part of a large concrete stairwell. The overwhelming force of the impact of the Mercedes with the barrier effectively turned the car into a massive frag grenade. Huge pieces of Levay's car were launched directly at the crowd, showering them in sharp, burning hot metal. But it wasn't just small fragments which made their way through the crowd, hitting anyone in the way. A majority of the car remained in large sections, flipping several times through the area, carving a 100-meter long path of mass casualties along the way. Almost the entire engine flew across the air, injuring several people and killing some. The car's thin, lightweight bonnet flew through the air like a frisbee and decapitated a number of spectators before finally landing. The front suspension largely stayed intact and crushed dozens more. Pierre was thrown from the car, immediately passing from the severe impact from landing directly onto the track. Mere seconds from the initial crash, the car's petrol tank exploded after landing on the embankment. Since much of the bodywork was made from a magnesium alloy, it could catch fire at a considerably lower temperature than other metals. These components lit up, burning a white-hot flame which burned much of the crowd severely. Unbeknownst to the emergency personnel, covering a magnesium fire with water doesn't put it out. In fact, it had the opposite effect. After dousing the blaze, the fire burned even greater than before and didn't stop for hours. That wasn't the only crash of the day, however. The Austin Healey, which the Mercedes had hit, smashed into a barrier before swerving into the pit lane. Luckily, Macklin missed a number of cars in the pit which had been refueling. Instead, though, he crashed into a wall, hitting a policeman, photographer, and 2 race officials. All of those people were badly hurt. Surprisingly, Macklin got away with only light injuries after managing to hop out of the wreck. The immediate aftermath of this huge catastrophe is also heartbreaking. Despite the widespread panic and chaos that day, the race continued. Mike Hawthorne, who was in the Jaguar and had driven in for the pits, was distraught. Immediately after getting out, his team ordered him to get back in and do an additional lap to get away from whatever was going on around them. When he came back to the pit 1 lap later, he was beside himself. He was adamant that he was the one responsible for the disaster. John Fitch was Pierre's co-driver. Since Pierre was going to be swapped out soon, John was already in his race suit. He, alongside Pierre's wife, Denise Bouillon, had both just witnessed the crash. Naturally, Pierre's wife was traumatized, so John Fitch stayed by her side to try and comfort her. After a while, John went to find a phone to contact his family back home and let them know that he was safe. Whilst out, he overheard a reporter state that several dozen deaths had already been confirmed. When he got back, he explained what he had heard to the Mercedes team and begged them to pull out, sensing a PR nightmare if they were to continue after everything that had unfolded. The team manager for Mercedes-Benz agreed, but unfortunately said he didn't hold enough power to make that call. In the early hours of the morning, after an agreement by the company's directors, Mercedes were finally able to wind down and pull out from the race. Interestingly, the chief engineer for Mercedes went over to the Jaguar camp to let them know and asked if they would pull out from the race too out of respect for the disaster which had unfolded. The Jaguar team manager at the time, Lofty England, real name Frank, turned them down. The Mercedes team packed up everything and headed back to Stuttgart. At the end of that year's season, Mercedes withdrew from competitive racing altogether. This decision wasn't because of this crash, and was instead a decision which had already been made at the start of that year. Amazingly, no official announcement was made on the night of the crash. Tens of thousands of spectators just a couple of turns away were none the wiser until word got around. The following afternoon, Hawthorne came first, marking a win for Jaguar. Over 50,000 people were there to witness the win, but there wasn't much in the way of celebration. Hawthorne did drink from the winner's champagne though, probably without thinking much of the poor optics this action would create. A few days later, a magazine used a picture of this and sarcastically captioned it, "To your health, Mr. Hawthorne." The various teams involved went back and forth, blaming each other for the incident. Ultimately, a verdict was reached after an official inquiry in which none of the drivers had the blame placed on them. Instead, it was put down to the track no longer being of a suitable design for the increasingly faster cars being put to the test. The track's design, paired with the positioning of the spectator stands, made the damage of the crash that much more devastating. Around $900,000 was spent on moving the stands to a safer position, and a number of other changes were made to improve safety for drivers and viewers. To this day, the Le Mans disaster of 1955 remains one of, if not the biggest loss to life during a motorsport event. Ever since this catastrophe unfolded, event organisers always have this event in the back of their minds, leading to much more consideration for spectator and driver safety. So, whilst it might seem a bit boring to have to watch racing through a fence, there is a very good reason for it.